Do you want to understand the triggers to your trauma? And do you want to know how you perpetuate your own suffering in this area? Well, this video will teach you the different default states you find yourself psychologically entangled in. Well, first and foremost, you need to build awareness in these four areas. The first one is to recognize the state you're in, followed by your personality patterns, then your thinking patterns, and finally, what is your go-to strategy to disconnect from your emotion? So in this first video, we're going to address these four styles, states, or patterns. And the first question now is, can you recognize what state your system is in? This is the state where you're feeling safe, you're calm, and relaxed, which translates to a healing state. This state is optimal, where your parasympathetic nervous system is humming nicely in the background, and perhaps you are too. The other state you might find yourself is when you're feeling wired to get into a fight or flight state. Your sympathetic nervous system's activated, you're assessing very acutely where the danger is or where the exits are. And if you've been in a fight or a fit of anger or in a situation of terror from humiliation, for example, recently, you might remember how this feels and recall that we can quite easily get locked in that state for a period of time. And finally, we have the freeze state. Sometimes this happens at the time of crisis, but other times it can happen after fight or flight, where we go to a place of shutdown because our system was so wired to the point that often we can't feel our feelings and our emotions, so we feel quite numb. We can experience states of depersonalization. We can feel states of total physical exhaustion because our system has deprioritized energy production because it's focused on danger signaling and keeping us safe. So if we can recognize where we are on the scale, we can then come to the stage of examining how this state is created. Of course, the optimal state we want to be in is safe and secure, void of threat. So this takes us to building awareness around your personality patterns. So what is your personality pattern? There are 5 main ones. The helper pattern is where we make other people's needs more important than our own, and we give to others as a way of trying to win self-worth and self-esteem. The achiever pattern is where we define our self-worth by what we do and what we achieve in the world. The perfectionist pattern is whatever we do is not quite right and not quite good enough. The anxiety pattern is where we're trying to think our way into a feeling of safety, that constant sort of driving of the mind. And finally, the controller pattern is where we're trying to control ourselves or the others or the environment. And unless we're in control in the ways we need to be, our system is not able to relax and to settle. So if we examine and understand again the states we get into and our personality patterns, how we default into them, it gives us the knowledge and informs us of what we need to address in order to change. We can also start to examine some of our thinking patterns. So, for example, you can have an underlying anxiety pattern or a controlling pattern, and day to day, moment to moment, these are the mental patterns that play out in your life. So, let's look at a few patterns. A common one is mental tennis. So just like the tennis ball, our attention is concentrated between a couple of alternatives and we go back and forth in our mind. An example might be, for example, you have a serious sinus problem. And when your sinus is out of control, you get exhausted, irritated, tired, and less productive. You can take an antihistamine that will stop within the hour and you'll feel dry and you can work in peace, but it blunts you in a certain way where you become kind of antisocial, you appear a little bit stoned, which means that your dinner party later tonight might question your attitude. So, do I take the pill or do I suck it up and suffer through for the sake of the dinner? What if I get too exhausted for the party, anyways, from all the sneezing because I didn't take the antihistamine? You get the idea. So, while we go back and forth in our mind, we're actually driving up our nervous system unknowingly. The other one is snowball thinking, and that also has a similar effect on your nervous system. Say it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you're struggling to get to sleep, and then your mind is thinking about an important meeting the next day. And you think, well, if I don't sleep tonight, I'm not going to perform in the meeting. If I don't perform in the meeting, I've got my appraisal coming up next week and I might lose my job. And if I lose my job, I can't pay the mortgage. And if I can't pay the mortgage, then, the family's not going to be safe. And then soon the kids will never ever go to college and they'll be unemployable while my partner's going to leave me, and so on and so forth. So, if you're familiar with CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, you'll know that another word for this is catastrophizing. The next one is mind blending, and this is when our brain is just running way too fast. Just like a blender, whatever goes into the world of chaos becomes part of that world of chaos because your mind is running too quickly, and soon you experience a state of overwhelmedness. And perhaps you shut down as a result of it, or maybe even begin to hyperventilate, so that manifests itself through your breathing pattern. Finally, imagine that your mind is a pair of sunglasses, whereby whatever information or data you input gets processed through that lens. So, for instance, if you have a mindset of not sleeping enough or on time, that's the thing that you're generally most focused on. Everything is filtered through that lens of not sleeping, like, oh, I had such a stressful drive at home, on the way home. My heart rate is just through the roof. That guy just almost hit me. How inconsiderate. I hope this doesn't affect my sleep, because if I don't sleep, I won't be able to function the next day, and the more I'll be on edge. Or if your mind is operating through chronic pain, for example, where everything is filtered through this anxiety reaction to the pain, like, say, for example, if I sleep in this position, I might contribute to that pain. Or if I do this bit of gardening or this bit of vacuuming, or perhaps upon reflection, you recall eating something sweet and then you ruminate over whether the sugar content has increased your level of inflammation and thus contributing to your pain. So these are examples of maladaptive stress responses and how that affects us, what it actually does. It depletes our capacity for functioning and for healing, which means that things that wouldn't otherwise be overwhelming become overwhelming. So ask yourself, what is your way of thinking? Now we've come to the last thing that we need to be aware of. How do you emotionally disconnect? So the first is to avoid and distract. And this is where we do whatever we can to be busy, to get caught up, and to always have the radio or the podcast in the background, the TV on. So we're constantly distracting ourselves away from what we're actually feeling. The second one is state changing, and this can be through drugs, alcohol, sex, work, exercise, food, using these consumables or strategies or activities to constantly change how we feel. Now, that's not to say that there's no time to avoid or distract yourself from certain emotions in a situation. There are definitely times when that's entirely appropriate. But when we become dependent upon them as strategies to avoid how we are feeling, that's when we have some real problems. The third emotional strategy is analysis paralysis, which I have touched on in previous videos. And this is when we analyze our feelings rather than feeling our feelings. Because who wants to feel negative emotions, right? They're so yucky, they're so uncomfortable. So we find it difficult to honor and sit with our negative feelings. to listen to why they're there and what they have to tell us. Instead, we're constantly thinking about assessing and analyzing what this means, what contributed to this, how the response could have been better, the environmental factors, and so on. And I actually know quite a number of people who can very eloquently describe their feelings in an analytical way, but not actually show that they're feeling anything that they're talking about. So they're not being really connected to how they feel. So that was the third emotional strategy. Now, the fourth is blaming others for our feelings, a very common one in family systems, actually. And it's something like, I'm feeling this because you did that, and because this person did that. It's a way of actually not owning how we feel and making it about someone else's behaviors, making it about purely the dynamic between yourself and somebody else or the group of people, which, is probably true. But by doing this, we also relinquish the responsibility for our own feelings and then the consequential behaviors that we exhibit. Because it's not our fault, right? It's that person's fault. That's why we got so mad and started thrashing the place or started yelling. Because that person pushed our buttons. Another strategy to effectively not feel is when we have this empath strategy, and this is quite prominent in people who tend to be quite sensitive anyways, emotionally sensitive. And this is when we feel other people's feelings as our own. We become so sensitized to everyone else's feelings that it almost becomes a way of avoiding and disconnecting from what it is that we are feeling, the feelings that are ours. We can't separate, and so everything just flows in and we reflect that back. The final strategy is somaticizing. And this is where we experience our emotion as physical symptoms. So if we're angry, we get a headache. If we're feeling sad, we get some tightness in our back. Or if we're anxious, we have a neck and shoulder issue. And it can sometimes be as literal as facing strong emotional pain, and that emotional pain is there, but we don't notice that, but consciously we're actually experiencing it as physical pain. And this is a very common behavior, a very common response in unresolved or complex PTSD. So the bottom line is that our emotions have to go somewhere. Now, to recap, we need to recognize what state our system is in. We need to examine how the state is being created and kept in that loop, being perpetuated. But obviously, that's not enough through personality patterns, thinking patterns, and avoidant patterns. Having awareness is great if we can see what's happening. It helps us understand it, but it doesn't change it. One of the complaints can be from that come from traditional psychotherapeutic approaches is that you can end up with all these awarenesses of what's causing the vicious cycle, but we're still running these patterns. And so what we have to do is to be able to retrain our mind to break these habits of thinking. You might have heard this line before: neurons that fire together wire together. So the more you have certain habits of thinking and behavior, you literally wire your brain to function in a certain way. And this is why within sports or martial arts or even things like driving, if you do endless drilling to train muscle memory, you're also wiring your brains instinctively to respond in certain ways. So your brain is just on autopilot with its reactions now. There's a low energy expenditure and the situation is dealt with, but in the case of a triggering of traumas, is not dealt with very effectively. So, whatever your personality pattern is, whether it is the achiever pattern or the helper pattern, the mental tennis that's running your system that goes into fight or flight or freeze state, these are all things that your nervous system has learned. You're probably not born this way. And even if you were born with some certain characteristics, they can still be rewired and changed. And that's why you hear the buzzword neuroplasticity. That really means that our neural networks are plastic and can be molded, just not at the snap of your fingers. But the way your unconscious mind works is that you have to work, you have to put in the work. It's not just a conscious level of awareness, but an unconscious level of retraining of habits and behaviors by conditioning new and different responses. This is such an important piece of rewiring and resetting your nervous system. So, in summary, we need to spend some time recognizing and tracking the states we find ourselves in, our general personality and thinking patterns, as well as our go to strategy to escape emotional malaise. I normally suggest to my clients to keep a logbook and track them over a period of 2 weeks. And then we'll come back, recoup, and discuss our findings. So, my suggestion to you is to be your own scientist and data collector. So, remember that you're not your emotions, nor are you your behaviors. Take a step back from judging your feelings, your thought patterns, and your behaviors, and be like a scientist. Simply say, that's interesting, and record it. You're not assessing or analyzing anything at this stage. You're simply collecting data through a survey of your own tendencies, from which you can create a hypothesis at a later stage, maybe on your own, maybe with the help of a close friend, a family member, or your therapist. We will look more into this in the coming videos and blogs, but essentially, we need to be looking at being disciplined and actively putting together new daily habits in place to form new patterns, practices of mindfulness and meditation to regularly activate the parasympathetic nervous system. Also, learning where the emotions sit in our body and in time. You know, when we're triggered with that emotion, when was the last time that we felt like this, and when does it remind us of? So learning where these emotions sit in the body and in time, and healing them from a deeper level. Also, in the coming videos, we'll delve deeper into these areas, including how to develop self-love and how to develop safety within our bodies. So ultimately, transforming the relationship you have with yourself within your body is the way towards rewiring your neurons and subsequently healing your traumas.